Death can be an expected or surprising event. It can be shocking in its permanence and provoke some of our strongest emotions. When it happens to an animal that we've come to know, it can raise questions about our role in the natural world and even bring a community of people from around the world closer together. We often feel strongly connected to the animals we watch on explore.org. They bring us joy and solace, but when they die, we can feel strong strong feelings of pain and sadness and loss, perhaps just as strong as losing a valued family member. But what lessons can we learn from these situations, and how might we cope? Death in nature is going to be the topic of today's live chat, brought to you by explore.org. My name is Mike Fitz, and I am the resident naturalist with explore.org, and I'm glad you could join me for this chat this afternoon on a topic that's perhaps not so easy to discuss. For the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to dive into this this difficult discussion on death in nature, and hopefully it will relate to some of the experiences that you've had watching the cams, and we can discuss different ways that we can cope with these situations. We will be taking a look at some of the recent deaths of animals that have happened on the cams, or animals that we know of that have either died or disappeared. And later on in the chat, I also will be talking about the death of an animal that was very memorable to me, and that was one that an event that I shared with thousands of people around the world who are also watching on explore.org. But this won't be a eulogy for those animals. I'm actually more interested in exploring the role of death in nature, discussing even some of the expected situations where we can expect animals to die on the cams, and think about maybe why that is, how we relate to the different types of animals that we see dying on the cams, and we'll also discuss maybe how you can cope with these situations, and how I've done so as well over the years. So again, my name is Mike, and if you have questions for me, you can share those in the chat on explore.org if you're watching on the live event channel there. If you're watching on Facebook Live or some other place, just drop your comments into the chat section on Facebook Live, and the moderators from explore.org will do their best to send them in my direction. And I will try to get to those later on in the chat, and I'll also be glancing off the screen from time to time to look at some of those questions that have been thrown up already to see if I can incorporate those into the chat. I also want to hear some of your stories as well on this topic, especially if it's associated with an animal that you've come to know on explore.org that has passed away, whether it was recent, just maybe a few weeks ago or last week, whatever it happened to be, or years ago. Maybe that was an event that you witnessed, or maybe it was something that was unexpected and an animal just kind of happened to disappear and not come back, and we don't really know what happened. But I'm interested in those stories too. So if you can, as we're discussing this today, if something prompts your memory and you want to share a memory or an event or some of those feelings that you had during those situations, put those in the comments too. And the moderators from explore.org will be reading those as well. And if they can put those up into the window for me, I'll try to share those with the audience a little bit later on. But like I said, this is kind of a heavy topic for us to discuss. But during the past several years, and certainly even over the past several months, we've had instances of animals, prominent animals, dying on the cam. One of the more recent ones happened to be from the Big Cat Rescue Facility in Florida, in the Tampa-St. Pete area, and that happened to be the death of Seth the tiger, who was a captive animal. And the Big Cat Rescue specializes in providing a permanent home to abused or abandoned big cats. So cats like Seth the tiger, he was given the opportunity to live a comfortable life and raise awareness for his species. So maybe he wasn't necessarily a wild animal, but he was an animal that a lot of us got to know just by watching him there. And again, he played an important role as serving as an ambassador for big cats and for the mission of the Big Cat Rescue. More recently, actually, we had the death of a very prominent hummingbird on one of our hummingbird cams. So on the Bella hummingbird cam, there was a mother bird just sitting on her eggs, and she happened to fly away from the nest, and it sounded like she got caught by something. We didn't actually see what happened personally, but the person who runs that facility suspects that it could have been caught by a praying mantis. And this is actually kind of news to me. I like to think of myself as a well-rounded naturalist, but there's a lot of stuff that I don't know. One of the things that I didn't know is that praying mantises are big enough and strong enough to prey on hummingbirds. And that is certainly a true fact. So that could have been the reason why she happened to disappear. We just don't know. So that was another recognizable animal that happened to disappear and is potentially dead right now. And then we also, last year too, there was an event that happened almost 11 months ago on the Decorah Eagle Cam, because there was a pair of eagles that had been nesting at that cam for a number of years. They, were just called, but, mom and dad. I think dad is the one, and eagle people, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think dad is the one who's up on the branch away from the nest. But about 11 months ago, the male eagle in this pair just happened to disappear. And the folks and other volunteers from the Raptor Research Center in Iowa were looking for the male eagle to see what happened. They couldn't really find any physical evidence of his disappearance. So we don't really know if he was driven off by another male eagle that was seen in the area around the same time. We don't know if he happened to experience a worse fate, like dying from, landing on a power line, getting electrocuted, or getting shot. We don't, getting hit by a car, is this picking up roadkill? We just don't know. So that was one of that was a very prominent instance of a disappearance, a mystery, and those are some of the ones that are maybe a little bit tougher to deal with, because you just don't know. There's not that sense of closure you might get when that perhaps Seth the tiger happened to die. So those are a few of the instances that have happened recently. I also want to share my experience with you about the death of an animal that happened in 2015, in the fall of 2015. And if you're familiar with the brown bear cams on explore.org, you probably know me from from those cams. I'm on there frequently during the summertime because brown bears is sort of my bread and butter, my favorite, one of my favorite animals, something that I know, at least I pretend to know a lot about. So in the fall of 2015, I casually, on Katmai's Facebook page when I was a ranger there, shared a screenshot of a mother resting with her cub. And then I went into the chat, into the comments on explore.org, and what I didn't see was this. I didn't see a cub stumbling and falling before it looked like it was just resting cutely next to its mother. And over the next several days, we actually watched that bear cub die right on camera. And this was probably the most poignant event I think that I have ever experienced watching these live nature cameras, because this was real. This was in Katmai National Park, a time of the year where there were few people around to witness this. Without the cameras, we probably would not have known about this event at all. And unlike most of the other documented cases of cubs dying at Brooks River in Katmai, this wasn't from a traumatic event. It was from an illness. And a necropsy of the cub later revealed that it died from canine adenovirus. So that's a virus that affects canines. It can affect bears. But I was watching that with thousands of people around the world, and the reactions that I had to that situation were, ranged everything from, a sense of loss and sadness. You could see that the mother bear was there to care for her cub, but she couldn't do anything about it. I also felt you know, in a way, and I don't want to say this is it's not a morbid fascination, but it was a fascination with the situation, the biology of it, because we didn't know what was happening. Sometimes I had these glimmers of hope that the cub would just get up and heal, because bears are remarkably resilient. But that was probably one of the more memorable and poignant moments that I've ever experienced on uh, on the cams on explore.org. And it really taught me a lot of lessons about maternal care, whether or not the animals that we see on the cameras, especially brown bears, are experiencing emotions. And that was a situation that probably convinced me that these animals are experiencing emotions, even if they're not conceptualizing it, thinking about it in the same way that we do. I think it was really hard to deny that the mother was feeling something in that situation. And certainly, if we can't deny that our own pets, our dogs and our cats experience emotion, then I don't think we can deny that in wild animals either. And that sometimes makes it even tougher to watch the death of an animal on our cams. Those are instances that were unexpected, but we're going to see certainly situations on the cams where animals will die, and we can expect that to happen. Again, going back to Brooks River, brown bear cubs, we like to get attached to them. They're very cute. They're they're playful. They tell us a lot about learning and maturation in the bear world. But the survival rates of cubs in Katmai National Park is actually quite low. And while we haven't witnessed, with that one exception that I mentioned before, we haven't witnessed a cub dying directly on the cams. That could certainly happen. The other instances that I can think of is that, a mother's going to walk away from the river one day, and then she's going to come back a couple weeks later, and she's not going to have those cubs. And that happens quite frequently. So those are expected instances of death on the cams. Again, there are lessons I think that we can think about and take away from those situations when they happen. We can think about the sense of loss that maybe the mother feels, but also we can perhaps empathize with the fact that she just needs to get on with her life. There may not be much survival of value in mourning. Because when you think back to the situation of the cub dying on the camera from canine adenovirus, the mother was there. She wasn't fishing. She wasn't nursing really her other cub. So did that put her at a disadvantage? From a survival perspective, we really just don't know. The other situation that we can expect to happen later this year, especially if you like to watch nesting birds, is a bit of sibling rivalry. And this is a fascinating phenomenon that happens in not only in birds, but it happens in mammals, and especially is prominent in certain species that we have on explore.org, like the blue herons that are starting to nest right now. And it's very difficult to watch. Blue herons are a species that begin to incubate their eggs as soon as they are laid. So what happens is that staggers the hatching time. Unlike a duck or a chicken that waits until all of the eggs are laid before it starts to incubate them, blue herons will lay an egg, start to incubate that one, and then maybe a few days later it'll lay another egg. So that egg that just is laid will have a delayed incubation time compared to the one that was laid a few days prior. So they hatch at different times. That gives the older chicks a competitive advantage. And when there's a food shortage, maybe there's not enough food brought to the nest for all of the chicks, the older chicks in those situations may attack and kill the other chicks. And it's certainly a very difficult situation to watch, but that's an expected event that could happen later this year. It's curious really to think about why that might happen. Does it give those older chicks a selective advantage? Does it allow them to survive just a little bit better? Because if they eliminate a competitor, whether it's a sibling or not, that means they can perhaps get more food from their parents. There's also maybe to not to that extreme, but a lot of other cases of sibling rivalry in birds, where just baby birds position themselves in the nest in a different way, so they're closer to where mother comes or father comes to bring them food. Uh, and eventually, those traits, if you are a fledgling, or if you're a chick that grows into a fledgling and you outcompete your siblings, maybe you have those traits that are genetically stored within you, and you're going to pass those traits on to your own offspring. So over time, you can see how those things get spread throughout a species. There's another perspective on this, though, and that's one that biologists will say, if you think about two siblings, like my brother or my sister, I shared genes with them. So it may be worth my while to make sure that their offspring, that they survive, they do well, and their offspring survive and do well. So the sibling rivalry, especially to the extreme that we see it in blue herons, really doesn't make sense from that perspective, because you're not, giving yourself that sort of inclusive fitness where you're spreading, you're allowing your shared genes to be spread throughout, throughout the world, because you're directly competing with your siblings. So there's a couple of different perspectives on that. There's really no clean answer, I don't think, to any of those situations. And how do we cope with those situations? I know some people are probably bringing up some questions and some stories about that. One of the ways that I try to cope when I'm watching this is just use the cold logic of Spock. If you've ever watched Star Trek, which I do like to do, you notice that Spock is very logical. He's not supposed to have emotion, although he breaks through every once in a while with an emotional statement, but it's pretty rare. So I often look for the coldly logic biological explanation, if there is one. It may or may not exist, but that can at least help us to understand maybe some of the behavior of these animals. One of the other things that I like to try to do is not to apply a sense of human ethics or morals to those animals, because when humans can delude themselves into thinking just about anything, but animals live in a different world, that they exist in a world outside of our ethics and morals. So I think it's appropriate to maybe judge the animals by their own perspectives and not necessarily through our own lens. And those are a couple of different ways that I cope by watching those situations. But of course, not all of those situations you can really tolerate the cold logic of Spock. Sometimes you need the brash, maybe, or some of these situations provoke the brash emotional reactions that perhaps Dr. McCoy and Star Trek had. So there will be moments from time to time, from the animal's perspective, things really go wrong. And that does raise the question about when it is appropriate for us to intervene in the lives of these animals. Some of the animals on explore.org are in captive facilities, kitten rescue. There's a lot of canine cameras that we have that show captive, domestic dogs. But there's also a lot of wild nature out there as well. And each situation is just a little bit different. I know some of the questions that I got in advance of this chat happen to do with that. Like what would be an appropriate means to step in and help these animals? And it really does depend on the people who are partnering, with the wildlife agencies, with explore.org. The federal agencies often have very strict guidelines on when to intervene, and it's usually they try to paint a fairly black and white picture about when they'll step in. For captive animals, I know our efforts make all the difference from those animals, because it clearly matters to them. It matters to those animals. With wild animals, it's a bit more of a gray area. It really does depend on staffing, facilities, funding. National park policy, for instance, with brown bears, especially bears, most of the time bears are left to their own devices. So when they get sick, they get injured. That's part of the nature that national parks are trying to protect. They're trying to protect those, not only the nice things in the world, the beauty that we experience in national parks, but also nature's harsh reality and those emotional and sometimes what can seem like very painful processes. But that's an important part of the ecology of these areas. And one other thing associated with death that I want to bring up, maybe before I get to your questions and stories and in just a few minutes, is why is it easy to watch some animals die and not others? We see that happen frequently on the cameras. Watching a bear cub die is not as easy to watch as a salmon that happens to get eaten alive. And that's something that we see at Brooks Falls all the time. We see hundreds of fish getting their skin stripped off of them, even though they are clearly alive when the bear begins to eat it. And why is that? I've thought about this question quite a bit, maybe a little bit too much. And I think it's partly because something like a salmon or a snake, a reptile, they're not furry, they're not feathery, they're not warm-blooded like we are, so they're a bit more distantly related to people, and maybe that's why we have a harder time empathizing with those animals. But those are we're going to see those animals die all the time on the cameras. And I don't mean to suggest that we should react to the death of a salmon in the same way that we should react to the death of a dog or a bear cub, because it would just be emotionally exhausting. I can't imagine watching the cameras or being able to do that with that level of emotional investment. But I do think there's some value in empathizing with those animals from time to time and extending our empathy to them, because a lot of those animals that aren't warm-blooded, that aren't fuzzy or feathery, don't get the same amount of attention, especially from in the conservation community, as other larger, more charismatic animals. So that is just a thought that I wanted to throw out there, because it is something that we're going to be experiencing nearly every day, of course, once the brown bear cam happens to go live once again. And we often focus on the plight of individuals, but that doesn't necessarily reflect the plight of species as a whole, too. So one of those things that I think about when we lose something like a tiger, or if a brown bear ends up dying, is that impacting the species as a whole? Because we are in a crisis of biodiversity across the planet, where humans are driving to extinction. So that's another aspect of death in nature that I think is a very important one to always keep in the back of your mind. And one final thought that I'll get to before I get to some of your questions and stories here, is maybe how to deal with death in a way that can help all of us. We all deal with death in our own way, and one of the more valuable ways to deal with it, especially if we're watching the cameras and we get to know and learn to care for an animal that we see, whether it's a hummingbird or an eagle or a brown bear, whatever it happens to be, is that when one of those animals dies, it can be a very emotional event for us. But there's a whole community of people that are watching at the same time. So we can find support with those other community members. And I think that's one of the most valuable things about the cameras on explore.org. And it's actually helped me to become a better naturalist, a better person, to consider the different perspectives that people bring when they're watching these cameras. We all bring our own set of, how should I say, perspectives, experiences, even our own biases when we watch these animals. And sometimes a new viewer will come in and they'll start watching the brown bear cams, and they'll make a comment and they'll say something that is surprising to me. And it's not necessarily wrong. It's that they have seen the animal through their own lens, through perhaps one that's unbiased by the knowing more about the behavior. And that is something I think that is really valuable. So you can share your experiences, share your memories of these animals, whether it's one of the rescue dogs on the Old Friends channel, or again, a brown bear cub that you had been watching for several weeks or several months. So the community support is really, really valuable. People are there for each other. That is one thing that I'm consistently, I shouldn't say surprised, but you know how the internet goes, right? The community on Explore.org is actually one of the more positive ones that you can find anywhere on the internet. So it's wonderful to have that level of support. It's also okay if you want to be an introvert too. And despite my chosen profession, speaking to people a lot about nature, especially brown bears, I actually do consider myself to be a fairly strong introvert. So when stuff happens, sometimes I just like to go sit in the woods and disappear for a little bit, and that's okay too. So we all have our own way of dealing with death in nature, but it's a meaningful event no matter how it happens. We're going to experience it in a lot of different ways. It's often unkind and unsympathetic, but it's just as much of a part of life as it is, as the birth of any creature happens to be. And I think we have a few minutes left in our chat. Again, my name is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with Explore.org, and we've been talking about the death of animals that on the cameras, the role death might play in nature. It does show us, a lot of, or provoke a lot of loss and pain in us, but it provides lessons in survival and can provide us with many opportunities to just think about how hard the lives of many of these animals are. So let's see perhaps what questions we might have here. I know there's been a lot that have been thrown up in my comments here. So bear with me one moment while I scroll through these. I know some people have been sharing a little bit of their stories as well. And there's a story to share here from Nature Girl. She says, I was in Yosemite during the time that 451's cub died. I sat in front of the visitor center watching because that was the only place I could get good enough cell signal. It was an emotional mixture of happiness being in Yosemite with all this beautiful, with all its beauty, and sadness watching the dying cub. And I think a lot of people were maybe experiencing similar feelings during that situation. I mean, we were watching the brown bear cams, seeing these beautiful animals, but at the same time, watching them, a death unfold right in front of our eyes. So thanks for sharing that story. Another one from a camera operator, actually. I've seen many animals die on these incredible sites on Explore.org. And as a writer, I've spent many hours writing poetry or short stories that have helped me to deal with these events. The feelings that came up with them, and in some cases addressed the feelings shared by others in the chat. In several cases, I've shared my writing on the chat. In many of these instances in which I share my writing, other chatters felt that their feelings were being expressed in my words. It has also led others to add their feelings, poetry, prose, and other expressive art forms on the chat, bringing healing and some degree of closure and a much tighter relationship among all of us. And yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think that's another really great way that we can find support with each other. Some of us like to talk about it face to face. Others like to sit more carefully and actually write down what we're feeling. And again, we can also be, the introverted among us and just go in the woods and sit and think about it. A couple of questions. Some people, one person is wondering about one of the more prominent bears that happens to show up at Brooks River each year, and that happens to be number 480 Otis. If you're not familiar with him, he's probably the oldest adult male that we know of at Brooks River. He is in his early 20s, probably around, well, if he comes back this year, he'll be about 23 years old, give or take a couple of years. And their question is, I worry about the passing of Otis. I know this will affect us all. Any ideas on how to deal with this? Well, I would not necessarily worry about it until the time comes, and it's going to come. I mean, you can think about it, and I have thought about it as well, because he is an older bear, and this could be the year that he doesn't come back. I should also say, he could live for another 7-8 years or maybe more. Bears do lead hard lives. It's likely that we're that we won't know what happened to Otis. It's likely that if he dies, he's just not going to come back. It's very unlikely that we would see an actual death on the camera. So that might help to lessen the blow. But again, like the Decorah dad who happened to disappear just a couple of years ago, or excuse me, last year around this time, there might not be that sense of closure. There's always going to be that mystery involved. Did he find another place to go to make a living, or did some worse fate befall him? We're probably not going to know with a lot of those prominent brown bears that we see on the cameras in Katmai National Park. So I would, think ahead of time how that is going to affect you. I would also take solace in the actual, and this is what I do when some of the bears that I like to watch don't come back, is the phenomenon of bears and salmon at Brooks Falls will continue. Otis might not be there, but that will open up perhaps other niches for younger bears to gain a foothold, to be successful, to raise their own offspring in that area. Salmon will be coming back, each and every year. So that will feed those animals, keep the population successful and healthy. Of course, it's always going to be a tough situation, no matter what happens. But I would think ahead of time about how you might react. And you'll know that you'll be able to share your love of Otis with hundreds and thousands of other people around the world, because he's such a prominent fixture on the bear cams. And I think I was looking I thought I had one more question in here, so I apologize for the pause, but I think that might be it for our questions for the time being. And I said I'd be with you for about a half hour. And it's a little bit after 1:30 local time where I happen to be. And again, this was sometimes a difficult topic to discuss, death in nature. It affects us all in a different way. It's associated with pain and loss. And I think we can look at some of the biological explanations for death in animals, why animals sometimes appear to be quite harsh towards even their siblings, their relatives, and of course, other animals in the world. Maybe we can start looking at these animals from their perspectives, try to put ourselves in their position. That might help us to understand those situations just a little bit more. It might make it harder, it might make it easier, I don't know, but there's a lot of different ways to cope. And I think we can also always, if we're looking for a suggestion, we can drop into the comments on explore.org, on any of the live camera streams, and ask other people what they think. I think that's probably one of the best ways to evaluate death in the animal world, especially when it happens to an animal that we happen to know quite well. Again, my name is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with explore.org. I'll be joining you again later this year for many other live chats on different topics, and I'll have a special guest co-host with me as well. But thanks for joining me and listening to me on this topic today, death in nature, and I will talk to you soon.